If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. For those who explore abandoned, rural, and creepy places in the middle of nowhere, have you ever encountered anything paranormal or otherwise unusual? If you live in North Carolina, then you've heard of Gravity Hill. You can look it up to get information about it, but one night it was me, my boyfriend, and 3 of his cousins, and we thought it would be fun to drive out to Gravity Hill and test it for ourselves. Something did, in fact, push us up the hill. Katie's car was in neutral, but something pushed us up that hill, and as we got to the top, Katie asked us if we wanted to go to the house. I asked what it was, and all 4 of them said in the sync that I had to see it for myself. We drove to the house, and as we got there, I asked what it was, and all 4 of them said in the sync that I had to see it for myself. We drove to the house, and as we got there, we found this very old, abandoned white house. I'd say it was maybe built in the late 40s or early 50s, but nobody's lived in it for years. I asked him to pull into the driveway, and he did. We sat there for a minute. I wanted to see if anything would happen because I didn't believe them. We sat in the driveway for 3 minutes at most, and when Katie said, "I'm about ready to leave, what about y'all?" As soon as he said that, his headlights dimmed so much that we thought they went out. I saw someone in the upstairs window only for a second, but someone or something was standing there watching us. It scared me so much that it brought tears to my eyes, and I was shaking. We sped off and didn't look back. I still remember the feeling of all my energy leaving my body, and I never want to experience something like that ever again. This story starts around the 25th of December. I was enjoying a trip with my family to Santa Barbara. Because I'm a big museum nerd, I convinced everyone to go to Solvang, a Danish town in the middle of rural California, for a day trip. As we strolled along the road, a Google Street View car sped by. Right in front of us was a couple in their 20s, one had dyed hair. I continued on with my day. A few days later, the trip ends, and I start to head back home. As we were getting onto a winding country road at about 5 in the morning, way before the sun went up, on the side of the last suburban street before hours of abandoned highway was a white figure. A lady stood beneath a single lamp. She slouched slightly. She had pale skin. She had scraggly hair. But the strangest of all is the complete lack of a face. I was a little freaked out by this, but I didn't want to wait and deal with drivers on New Year's Eve. Soon, thick fog set in, and I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. This road was very windy, as there was a valley below. After about 10 minutes of driving, the road started turning, and every 5 feet was a new sign saying what to do, slowly getting more nonsensical. From rock warnings back to back, to signs saying to turn off all lights, to signs saying to just stop. After a couple minutes, everything returned to normal. My theory is that this was a transitional space, and I have changed universes. Today, I went to an ice cream shop and, on a whim, decided to check if I was on Google Maps. I opened it up and went to the bakery I had just gotten out of when the car passed by. There was someone with dyed hair, and everything else was normal, but I and my family, who were traveling with me, were gone. I checked the dates, the images were only a month old. This explains quite a bit. The day after, I was staying in a hotel, and all the lights went out for hours. These people, who were relatively close to civilization, seemed unfazed by the situation. They acted as if this was completely normal. Yet, mere months earlier, the city would have been a mess if power went out, as it did, but only for a couple minutes. It shut down all of the casinos for a bit. Now, they were all back up by the time I left the building. There was a building behind my house that looked abandoned, and I could see it from my bedroom. One midday, I decided to look at it because sometimes the lights from the windows in the building turn on, maybe an abandoned office used as storage? Anyway, I looked out, and I saw a black, tall figure or silhouette in one of the windows, and it popped into the window frame and moved back to the side, as if it were trying to look outside too, except it seemed really off. I was confused since I had never seen people in there, and I was only able to see through because of the light outside. It popped back again and slowly walked backwards while looking at me. Eventually, it vanished into the darkness. It was so ducking weird. There's a town in Bedfordshire called Flitwick, and I've lived here for my whole life. So I don't usually share on here, but I felt like I should because when I asked my friends about this, they all said that they'd experienced similar things. So, there's this forest near my mate's house, and when I went around for a sleepover, I saw some shit. We went around the forest to sneak into one of the old abandoned sheds and have a few puffs of our vapes, but after a while we kept hearing some knobheads laughing in the distance, yet we couldn't see them, so we just carried on. We ended up stopping to have a puff, and we were starting to get paranoid because we kept hearing twigs snapping, but we guessed it was just a nick rush. We got to the edge of the forest and were about to open the gate after she stopped and was like, "You see that?" And it was some random cracky standing just staring at us. He was not a normal cracky, though. He looked like a bootleg. Jeff is the killer, to be honest. Shoulder-length black hair, a white hoodie or jumper, and the carved red smile. We could make his face out, but my friend's shitty iPhone didn't have great resolution, but you can still make out his features. After a few seconds of staring at that minger, he started flailing his arms like an absolute bellend, but we were scared shitless. After a while, he stopped and just started cranking his head around like a duck head, and that's when my friend took a picture of him. He didn't seem to like that and started bolting towards us, and we ran for it. Keep in mind that he was probably about 7 to 8 meters away from us. We skedaddled all the way out of the forest and back to my friend's house that's down the road from the forest, and because it was already starting to get dark, we just tried to forget about it. This experience took place in the summer before my 8th birthday. I was out hiking in the foothills around my hometown with the rest of my family. We often made day trips like this, and before gas was so expensive, it was a common weekend activity. Most of my family as well as the family dogs had gone ahead on the trail we were walking, but me and my dad stayed behind so I could climb and check out some of the large rocks and boulders along the path. Going off the trail a little bit, I was checking out a very large rock formation when I realized there was a small cave on the other side of it. Being a dumb kid with his dad nearby, I quickly ran in to explore it. Being a very sunny day, it took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dark. I heard my dad coming around the rocks and asking what I had found. He suddenly stopped behind me, and for the first time in my life, he sounded scared. He told me to look at the ground and head straight for a small opening at the other end of the cave. Now scared out of my mind, I asked him why as I planted my eyes on the ground. He shakily says there are things I don't want to see in there, and I need to get out. Still confused but scared as hell, I run for the other end of the cave, get through the opening, and keep running away from the rocks. Back on the trail, my dad is suddenly beside me and says we need to find the rest of the family. As we quickly headed up the trail, I asked what was in there. He simply says bad stuff. We catch up with the family, and he tells my mother to take me to the car while he and my much older brother go back to the cave. They come back a little while later, both looking very shaken. He tells my mother that we need to contact someone to come up here. As we are heading home, I ask my brother what was in the cave. He then tells me that I had been standing in a witch's circle, or, as I know now, a pentagram. He then explains that the entire cave was covered in satanic markings and dead, fully skinned and mutilated, animals. Where I was standing, there was a severed goat's head on a rope hanging above me. We contact the authorities, and they find several other ritual sites in that area. Needless to say, we never went there again. When I was younger, I used to live in an old house with my family, though my mom will only be relevant in this story. In the middle of a small farmer community, our house was far enough away that we weren't really bothered by anyone except by the rare jogger here and there. Now, where we lived always had an odd feel to it, as in, it never really felt as if you were in any area alone, though at this age, around 8 to 10. I usually didn't stay too long at home as we lived in a large property area with a large potato patch and a swamp area, along with many others. There was always something to do, though one area stuck out to me whenever I explored. It was located just past the potato patch and was a large pond right beside a swamp-like area. I frequently visited that pond up until the day of my final visit. It was a crisp night as I woke up feeling quite thirsty, so I walked to the kitchen, which had a window looking over the whole back area of our house, and she caught my eye, a young girl in what appeared to be a white gown standing over the pond, just standing there staring, and before I knew it, as if it were a dream, I was now standing in the middle of the field. Water still in, looking around the night was perfectly visible, and staring at the pond once again, she was still there, though this time staring at me almost into my soul. I saw it. Oh God, I can never forget that awful face. It was the stuff of nightmares, yet so alluring. Even after realizing it, I found myself getting closer. I just kept going. I couldn't stop myself from walking into it. It was like a spell. I couldn't scream. I couldn't stop. I was under her control. I kept walking until I reached the bed of the pond. Looking in, I could not see a bottom. What happened next was somewhat of a blur. All I remember next was feeling a hard shove, along with the feeling of being restrained, and then it was just nothing. I had awoken to the crack of dawn and my mother running over to me, screaming my name. I was soaking wet and had red marks on my arms, though I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't know if I could. Shortly after that, we moved houses, and I am now happily, for the most part, living in a nice place in a large town far away from that place. While we were in college, my brother needed to get some interesting shots for his photography class. He wanted several pictures of old or abandoned buildings, so I would drive him around town until we found a suitable location. One day, while driving on the highway, we saw this one building that was under construction. It wasn't what we typically went after. This was a new build, and there was nothing old about it, but there was something odd about it. I pulled into the parking lot, and it was clearly still an active construction site, but no one was there. Anywhere. We felt a bit bold, so we walked into the half-built interior. There were some tools and construction materials, but very little else. In the very center of everything was a large hole. Something about it was very off, and neither of us got anywhere near it. We then walked out the back door, and nailed to a tree was a workman's uniform. Above the uniform, where the head would go, was a cow skull. Well, a few quick photos were taken, and we got the hell out of there. I sometimes feel like that had to have been a dream, but we have photos of it. I'm not sure if I saw that building again, either. This happened when I was a senior in high school. Some friends and I were looking to liven up a boring Saturday night and decided to sneak into and explore an abandoned naval hospital in our town. We snuck in on our bellies under a gate and planned to exit through a small hole we found at the end of a road on the other side of the grounds. We walked around for probably 20 minutes, and nothing remarkable happened. We found some old medical equipment, we got scared by a deer that was roaming around, nothing crazy. We'd had our fun and decided to head up the old road to the small hole in the fence when we noticed that someone was walking down. Our first thought was that it was security, and we were about to be in big trouble for trespassing. But as it got closer, we realized it was anything but. The figure was dark and moved slowly. It was pushing what looked like an empty old flat shelf cart, which made a very creepy creaking sound that I'll never forget. Since our only other option was running back towards the hospital, we had no choice but to keep walking and walk past the figure. As we came right up next to it, we all snuck a glance, and it was just black, no features or anything, just a figure. Not once did it turn to look at us or acknowledge us. My friend screamed, and that's when we all took off, running through the hole in the fence without looking back. Once outside the fence, we were all shaken up and tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Someone suggested it could be a homeless person, but A, there is no way that cart would have fit through the hole and there was no other hole, and B, this hospital was on top of a steep hill and not an area where homeless people usually venture, so we realized this was fairly unlikely. We got in our cars and left, and as my friend and I drove down the hill and past the hospital, all the lights in her car, inside and outside, flickered off and on again. She stepped on the gas, and we got the hell out of there. I slept with the lights on for 3 nights after that. It's been 7 years now, and I would say this is still one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. In college, I liked to go exploring random places with my group of friends. We'd just pick a direction that looked undeveloped and keep walking. Most of the time, it was just an excuse to hang out and walk around, but sometimes we found interesting stuff. I came across a buffalo farm once, hung out with the buffalo, met the farmer, and got to know him a bit. I walked around old cemeteries and forested areas behind schools and offices. Stuff like that. There was definitely a lot of trespassing, but it was all innocent, so we were never really too worried about getting into trouble. If someone told us to leave, we just would. Anyway, one night we were walking down some train tracks, not on the train tracks, it was an active line, and we weren't that stupid, and came across some old abandoned buildings. I really wanted to check it out, but everyone else was too spooked to do it at night, reasonable, in hindsight, because it looked like people may have been squatting there or something. So, we came back the next morning. For the most part, it was what I expected. Shattered windows, a deteriorating foundation, and a lot of graffiti. We hung out for a while, took some pictures, and checked out all the different art painted on the walls and stuff. But on the back wall was the weird shit. There was a stone slab on the floor, maybe 2 feet high and 8 wide by 4 long. There were some old candles behind it, which we just took as evidence of squatters or other kids coming to do drugs and spray paint or whatever. But when we looked closer at the slab, we noticed something weird. At first, we thought it was just some feathers and fur, which was already kind of weird, but when we got closer, we found almost all of a canine skeleton. Most of the fur was all there, chunks of the body and legs, the skull, all laid out on this slab with candles behind it. I wish I could tell you that we figured out what had happened there, or that we came back and saw something more crazy, but we didn't. We hung out a little longer, explored around the building a bit, took some more pictures, left, and never came back. Whatever happened, that body, probably a dog, was definitely brought there and laid out intentionally. It was very strange, and it was difficult not to think of all these cult-like narratives. While I can't give any proof of this and it may sound fake, both me and my friend knew what we saw, and it's something I remember quite well along with him. I had been out camping with my mom and her friends who had kids around the same age as me, about 15, and during that night both me and my friend had seen something that apparently no one else did, or they just weren't paying attention. I told my mom that I had seen some kind of orb of light pass by, and my friend backed me up on it, though he said he saw a girl in a dress along with the orb, but she passed it off as a car or our imagination. To me and my friend, that wasn't believable, as the orb was too high off the ground and wasn't on the road. After having been told to ignore it, me and my friend decided to go out and investigate, so we both got out the flashlights and discussed what we had seen. As we explored the path, we saw the light go down, and while we didn't find that light, we definitely could see dark shapes move behind the trees. There wasn't anyone around this area, we were sure of that, but seeing as both of us enjoyed the supernatural, we continued to investigate. The light wasn't the creepiest part of this story, though. The dark shapes we saw were definitely not real people, but they did seem to exist there. It wasn't a trick of my mind, seeing as my friend had seen the exact ones too. We had gotten to the bathroom area of the camp, and that's actually when we noticed a black figure in the middle of the clearing nearby the bathrooms. She shone out the lights at it, and it quickly seemed to disappear. We looked around more before we heard some kind of whispering around us that we couldn't figure out. After that, we decided it was best to hurry back to the campsite. On the way back, we were both paranoid and felt like someone or something was watching us. Which most of the time someone is according to studies, but we couldn't see anything or anyone but a few dark figures around in the trees. We made it back to the campsite, but no one believed us. While seeing black figures in the shadows is common for people with mental illnesses and such, I wouldn't imagine we'd both see the exact same things. The light and the dark figure were both creepiest to us, and we're still unsure of what it all was. There was always a legend around my town of an old abandoned mansion on a large golf course a little out in the countryside. Apparently the mansion was white all over. When I was very young, maybe 8 or 10, a few older kids told me they went there one night, around 2 a.m., and snuck into the golf course. The mansion was located through some creepy woods and was situated on the other side of them. That night it was very cold, it was around October time, and apparently when these older kids got to the mansion, it was larger than life. They crept in and wondered about exploring it. I don't have major details, but one thing really sticks out in my mind from hearing that story. Apparently, there was an old grand piano still in the house, and as they were about to leave, probably disappointed, it started playing. WTF. So yeah, I still occasionally see the guy who told me this, and to this day, Dan still says he heard it play. Apparently, they kept running and running till they couldn't stop, with a crazy feeling they were being chased. In true tradition, me and my friends tried to find this mansion one night but never could. I've since heard it's been demolished. I ride my bicycle at night. There's nothing, to me, more freeing than the sensation that I have the world to myself and can explore and adventure as I please. Last night, I was biking through the neighborhood of my childhood and teenage years. I was in a mood for a bit of nostalgic melancholy, I suppose. There's a road where the development ends that I called the Creepy Wood Street when I was a kid. One side has houses, the other is a train track topped hill. The name came from before the area was expanded, and it was a dirt track cutting through the woods. So I was in the former Creepy Woods area when I noticed something felt off. I felt a presence, and I can only say it felt like rot. It is hard to articulate it precisely. Around the time I was aware of this presence, I was aware of something else, silence. The crickets had stopped their chorus, and the air seemed to keep moving, but the rustle of the trees and bushes was somehow muted. Strangely, there was a sensation that these were faded out rather than an immediate cessation. About this time, I began to feel hunted. I guess fight or flight told me hard flight, and I began to pedal like a maniac. I had the notion to not look back. I'm not sure why. When I got off the road, I felt a little bit better, but I still watched. It was then that I heard what a lot of folks would think was a blood-curdling scream, but I recognized it as a vixen's call. We have a ton of foxes in my area. I somehow felt drawn to it, and sure enough, as I turned off towards it, I saw her, a red vixen. This was a little unique, as I have only seen brown ones before. She regarded me for a moment, then ran off towards the creepy woods. I didn't think a ton of it until I saw a fox at the next turn who did the same, then again at the next intersection, which was the road leading out of the neighborhood. Granted, I knew the way out, but I felt like I was being guided by them somehow. All of them also dashed off after I looked at me for a moment, all towards the road where I felt like something was after me. So, I am curious to know what anyone thinks. I'd like to know if anyone has an idea what that thing after me was and also why the foxes seemed to show me a safe path. This story took place in the spring of 2018. My friend and I were 21 years old. I met my friend G when we were in high school. He shared my love for outdoor adventure. There is a walking trail in our Midwestern US town that was once a railroad. The tracks have been taken up and replaced with highly compacted, fine gravel. This trail carves its way through heavily forested hills and valleys for well over 10 miles. G and I like to walk this trail at night. Firstly, because we had no other time to do so, and secondly, because it was simply too thrilling. Miles away from town in a dark forest full of God knows what. We have heard our fair share of freaky noises that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. In the darkest, most dense part of the forest, the trail is surrounded by huge trees that are close together and block even the light of a full moon to the point where you can barely see the white gravel. We had a no flashlight rule that we stuck to because, believe it or not, you can see much farther without one. Even when it's cloudy. Shining a light, your view is obstructed by all the branches and undergrowth that is otherwise muted. Of course we carried flashlights in case of an emergency. By no flashlights, I mean we didn't walk with them turned on and instead relied on our eyes adjusting to the dark to see. Anyway, I digress. The darkest part of the forest also happens to be where the ghost town is. Around the year 1923, per the fireplace in one of the houses, 5 river cabins were constructed along the railroad in close proximity. They were primarily used for bootlegging during Prohibition. These cabins were inhabited all the way up until the 1970s. They have long since been left abandoned. G and I took an interest in them and decided that we would get together during the daytime the next time we had the chance and go photograph and find out all the information we could about these cabins so we could research them. The first house is basically non-existent. There is no floor, and there is no roof. Only asbestos walls on stilts and a porch. The second house is basically caved in. The ceiling sags to about 4 feet, 1.2 meters, off the floor. The third house is in fairly decent shape and still houses its furnishings, shag carpet, yes, really, and a solid wood television with the channel buttons on the front. The fourth house is the most cabin-looking one of them all. 2 rooms and a front porch. The fifth house is by far the best preserved. Newspapers from 1979, painted walls, calendars, magazines, furniture, and glassware are still in the cabinets. You name it. This is all the information gathered prior to the day the story takes place. Well, this particular day, G and I had documented everything we could about houses 1 to 3 and made our way across the ravine that separated 3 and 4. House 4 has a front porch that fell down. So to get to the front door, you have to climb up a steep porch that is basically vertical. I made my way up this porch and had to grab the lip of the board that would have originally been against the house. I pulled myself up and straddled the board. I looked around the dark house and pushed the screen door open with a metallic crank. A deep silence filled the world. I peered into the darkness there without making a sound. Then it came. A startlingly loud hiss. The hiss froze me in place. What was that? I thought. I turned to look down at G and smiled. Are you ducking with me? I asked. G's eyes were wide, and an expression of terror was on his face. That wasn't me, he whispered. Knock it off, come on, I said so, and it came again. Hiss was louder this time. I turned to look back inside the house. I pulled the flashlight from my pocket and shone it into the darkness. A beam that fell from the roof was lying at an angle from the ceiling to the floor in the middle of the front room. On that beam was perched an enormous vulture. It had its wings outstretched to make itself look more imposing, and it let out a third hiss and flapped its wings. I let out a chuckle and said, "We'll come back later." And we slid down that porch and left. While vultures are for the most part harmless towards humans, I have heard stories that if they get frightened, they can projectile vomit onto their would-be predators. I really didn't need that. While this may not be the most terrifying story, I hope you enjoyed the imagery because, in reality, it was quite scary when it happened. Also, G's face was priceless in real life. Funny enough, this wouldn't be the last time I encountered this bird. A couple of years later, I was walking with another friend of mine, W. I was interested in seeing the houses in person since I had previously told him about them when we were at work. I took him up to see house 4, and while we were examining the side of the house, that goddamn buzzard tore out of a hole in the side of the metal roof, screeching and hitting every obstacle on the way out. It sounded like the whole forest was coming down. W and I were both on the ground after ducking in a hurry, and we shared a good laugh afterwards. Nothing beats a thrilling real-life jump scare. Last summer, in 2011, my friends and I went on a paranormal investigation streak. Being from small-town Wisconsin, we had little to do but drive to distant places and hope for a thrill. Still in high school, we took advantage of our curfewless nights and stuffed a backpack with flashlights, mirrors, incense, candles, matches, and a wide assortment of ghost hunting gear. My friend Liz and I researched supposedly haunted places near where we lived. This particular place was in Dousman, Wisconsin. It was called Tabernacle Cemetery. With the sun quickly setting, we hopped in my car and made the 30-minute drive. It was just me, Liz, and our friends Beth and Rob. We found the road upon which the cemetery was supposed to be located, but couldn't locate it. After about 20 minutes of driving back and forth, my headlights finally caught a few gravestones we'd missed before. The cemetery was located on an overgrown hill, which explained why it was difficult to see. We pulled off to the side and trekked through the brambles to the graves themselves. Strangely, the dates on the graves generally ended around 1880 and picked up again about 1950. It seems as if the place had been abandoned for the 70 years in between, as many of the gravestones were so weathered they were illegible. Not much happened that night, and when a van full of raucous 20-somethings raving about K2 pulled up, we lost interest quickly. The only interesting thing that came from the trip was a chunk of crumbled gravestone that I took with me. As we pulled away from the graveyard, a large truck appeared behind us with its lights on. While I was unnerved, I was concentrating on finding a way home since the main road was closed for construction. After a half hour of losing ourselves on the back roads, with the truck always behind us, we said duck it and just drove on the rocky, mid-construction main road. I was so busy paying attention to the road that I didn't notice the truck turn off. About 6 months later, we were all at Barnes & Noble. I stumbled upon a book called The Wisconsin Road Guide to Haunted Locations by Chad Louie and Terry Fisk. Out of curiosity, I opened the index and found Tabernacle in there. With all of my friends around me, I jumped up and screamed as I read the following excerpt. The dare: if you drive to the cemetery late at night, a mysterious truck will appear and follow you until you get back to the city. Being previously unaware of this, we all decided that it was worth looking into again. I think I met a spirit residing in a mental institution. For context, I can't say which one because I'd probably catch a case for this unless the limitations leave me beyond repercussions, so I cannot say which abandoned institute it was, but it was in Indiana. So my friends always went there, skipping school. There were 7 or 8 buildings in total. There are tunnels below that we explored, as well as closed-off areas where the roof collapsed. Anyway, me and 2 of my friends, A and K, went to the basement of the first building we ever went to. There are obviously no lights. So we took some papers, burned them for light, and made a makeshift torch to travel. When we were exploring the tunnels, we went back to the stairwell area, where the room next to it had a fire. It was embers now. The room was covered in stacks of papers and metal shelves. So I get this idea to do a low kick to the embers to make a flashy, cool-looking kick through the embers. It was a terrible idea. A called it the Ken Firestarter kick because I kicked the embers, and they immediately engulfed the papers behind in flames. It was a big fire that happened literally in an instant. So we ran upstairs and explored for maybe 10 minutes more. Then, K says, "Dude, we gotta bounce," and points outside. The smoke was very dark, and there was a lot. So we ran as fire trucks went down there. When we heard the sirens, we dove to the train tracks. We made it out. So the next day, my buddy, A, wants to skip school there. So we go, and we get through the front door. Then, from the basement tunnel entrance, a homeless-looking guy comes out and asks us what we were doing here. We told him we were skipping school. So he says, "I'm hunting for treasure here. We can stay as long as we want. Just don't burn the place down." I felt like this guy was off. He knew something he didn't tell us. Then he said, "Be careful," and he went into the tunnels. So me and A start traveling through and notice there's cops outside driving and parking out front. So we panicked and went to the roof, and then when another showed up, we went to the tunnels. We never saw the guy again. We went through both ends, and yeah, the tunnels go through every building. We should have run into him again the way we did. He was gone. He didn't go out front because of the cops, so where did he go? I feel like he's one of the few people who went missing when the place closed. It still freaks me out to this day. He had to be a spirit. I have more stories from this place, as well as some involving paranormal encounters or just wild days there. I wouldn't mind reliving those moments for all the internet to enjoy, lol. So my friends and I were a little drunk and decided to explore this old, abandoned hospital. This was a really old hospital. The psych ward itself was creepy. There were still cuffs hanging from the walls. A room that still had padding on it, although the padding was torn up. There was just an eerie feeling in that area. We kind of felt like someone was with us, but there was no one there. We just shook off that feeling and decided it was paranoia. Well, some of the hospital is gone, so in one part of the psych ward, the wall is missing, and it's just an open area outside where part of the hospital used to be. That's when we noticed the incinerator out in the open. Well, we decided that we should explore the incinerator. Stupid on our ends. There were thorny bushes around the door of the incinerator. We tore it down. I climb in first, and it's very dark. I had a flashlight, but I didn't really see anything. Well, the floor was squishy, and around the time I noticed it, it kind of collapsed, and I fell down. I got back up, and my friends got in, and we shined our flashlights around, and that's when we realized the floor was ashes. So I basically fell into ashes. I have no idea if they were actually dead people's ashes. I was covered in ashes. Head to toe. There were black widow spiders in the incinerator. There were bones. Though I believe the bones were not human, some of the skulls were animals. My friends said they were human bones, but I really have no idea. One of the bones looked like a femur. I might have a picture of all the bones we found because they took the bones with us when we left. I don't know why. They're EMTs, so maybe just because they're in the medical field. Anyway, so that eerie feeling comes back that someone else is out there. So we're freaking out. There was whispering and weird noises. We could hear tapping. It got really cold, really fast. And this was a hot, humid summer night. It was 85 degrees. We were under heat warning, and it was suddenly really cold when we started hearing weird noises. We killed the flashlights and slowly made our way out of the incinerator in the dark so that if other people were there, they wouldn't see us. We left as soon as we could. It was just a gut feeling that we weren't alone. I had to shower to wash the dead people's ashes off me. There's more crazy stuff that happened the week following that exploration, but that's an entirely different story. Several years ago, my boyfriend, his cousin, and I went to an abandoned asylum. It was closed before I was born, so I never heard of it. A friend on Instagram took a photo there, and I knew immediately I wanted to go. I convinced the other two to go the next afternoon. The trip to get there was relatively long, and we had the radio on. His car had a radio that displayed the name of the song, and at one point, when we were close to the place, though no song was playing, the radio was stuck on the word God. This was probably the first sign of trouble. We arrived at the asylum's campus. It was a self-sufficient community when it worked. Had power buildings, a rec center, a dorm hall, and classrooms. As stupid teenagers with cameras, we wanted pictures of the inside of these buildings, so we ventured inside the first one we found. It was a dorm with long hallways. The building was really quiet inside. There was no wind or anything else outside. We entered on the second floor out of 3. We walked down the trashed hallways and over the broken glasses, checking out rooms. Above us, we are shuffled, and we assumed there are other explorers in the building. So we headed up the stairs to say hello, and there was no one there. The buildings echo like crazy, so we would have either seen or heard them walking away. We continue on to other buildings, and not much happens. We hear creaks and crackles, but nothing sounds more than understandable. Until we got to the old powerhouse. It had catwalks that went from the height of the building to a steel door onto a roof. We decided to go up there, and although slightly unstable, it was not paranormal. We got to the top, where the door was wide open, and my boyfriend went to walk out, and the door slammed shut. This door was steel and fairly heavy, and there was nothing touching it. We had been standing still for a minute talking, so it wasn't the vibrations from us walking. We pulled and pulled on the door, and it would not budge. Cousin is looking for a way out of a nearby window, and before he attempts to climb out, the door opens like nothing happened. This is where we should have decided to go home. The last building we visited was the hospital. It was a really long building, and the only entrance that wasn't boarded up beyond belief was a window to the basement. We squeezed our way into the dark basement. Little bits of light were peeking in from the outside sun. We walked around and discovered the morgue. Aside from it being cold and feeling sad, nothing happened down there. We head up the stairs to this long yellow hallway. You could see straight across to the other side of the building to go upstairs. Depending on which one of us tells this story, this part is a little different. All of us had different paranormal experiences at the same moment. For me, I remember not hearing anything but a high-pitched ping, like when a grenade goes off in a game too close to you. I looked down to the end of the hall at the archway leading to the stairs, and I saw a silhouetted hand with elongated fingers gesturing me to come closer. So I walked toward it without a second thought. Mindlessly, we had all separated from each other. Then a long bang rings through the halls. I turn around and see them mouthing to hide below a window because an op is outside looking in. We hide, and then, when the coast is clear, we make the fastest beeline out of the building and back to the car. We drove home, terrified. To this day, we all can't believe this happened to us, but it did. I consider this to be one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I do have a few, but this is high up on my list. I was about 14 years old. I was dating this girl, and we lived far away from each other, so we didn't get to hang out much. I decided I would go with her to her dad's house, which was right in the middle of nowhere in West Ireland. Ireland is now known for having a lot of open areas, greenery, and fields. So, of course, old buildings come along with the scenery. Not only was her dad's house the creepiest thing I had ever seen at the time, but the area was so much worse. After dinner, we said we would go for a walk and have some time alone together. It was summertime, and long evenings made the day even more in our favor. Holding hands and stealing kisses every moment I could. When you're 14 and dating a 16-year-old, you kind of have to take hold of the situation. After about 30 minutes of walking, we came up to this old, broken down looking house. More abandoned, I would say. It was surrounded by a large stone wall, which was easily 7 feet high and carried itself all around the house. As we searched for a way in, my girlfriend called out to me and pointed to the large trunk of a tree that was resting on one corner of the wall. We made our way over and began profiling the area, analyzing every little thing we found. Clearly, the place had been abandoned for quite some time. My girlfriend waved me over to a window that was easily pulled open. It was right then that I started to feel sick to my stomach. But, thinking it was nothing, I quickly followed her inside. It was empty, there was no furniture in sight. Just peeling wallpaper, ripping up carpet, and having a ceiling worthy of collapsing. We ended up wandering around and finding ourselves upstairs. It was then that we heard a knock. And then another knock. This happened 4 times, not too far apart from each other. Thinking that someone might be in the house somewhere, we made our way down the stairs. The knock again. This time, it's louder. My girlfriend directed me into a room that could easily have been the kitchen. She looked at me, then at the floor. On the floor was a cell door. In Ireland, cell phones are not a huge thing, except in old houses. But, then again, a cell door is even more strange. I leaned down and pulled the door open. It creaked and screeched, and as I took out my phone to shine a light down, my girlfriend insisted I should check it out. Because she was 2 years older than me, I felt as if I had something to prove, so I agreed to go and check it out. The ladder down was old, and I felt it could fall underneath my weight. When I got down, I moved my light across the room. Empty. Nothing but a single chair. It was then that I heard the most gut-clenching growl. I fled up the ladder, grabbing my girlfriend's hand. Whatever it was, it made me run. And not look back. We made it to the wall outside, where I boosted my girlfriend up onto the wall and egged her to pull me up. As her hand held mine, I felt as if someone or something pulled on my hood and fell to the ground. Winded and trying to catch my breath, I gazed up at my girlfriend, who was wide-eyed and staring at the house. I turned around to push myself off the ground when I caught a glimpse of what had my girlfriend's attention. A gray, demonic figure with the most evil and menacing grin across its face. If I can even call it a face, I shouted at my girlfriend to pull me up now. She grabbed my hand, and we ran till we could no longer see the house. We made it back to her father's house, settling in her room for the night. But it didn't stop there. The sounds of scratching and tapping at the window rang through our ears for the night. Whatever we saw must have followed us home. That one sound, though, the sound of a music box. Every so lightly playing its music from under her window. We didn't dare look out, fearing what we might see. We stayed till the sun came up, and all sounds faded with the darkness. The next morning, I went home, and we didn't speak about that night. It's safe to say we didn't see each other again. We decided it was all too much for us. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. My life is full of things that I cannot explain. Here's one of them. But I have many. If you made it this far, I thank you. Keep sharing your stories. I was on a solo hiking trip in Norway, which lasted about 10 days. Well-equipped cabins with dormitories are scattered all over the area, usually about a day of hiking apart from each other. Most nights I slept in my tent, but a few nights when the weather was awful, I stayed in one of the cabins. One sunny morning, I left from such a cabin, heading in the direction of another one. The distance between these two was unusually long. It was not impossible to do it in one day, but seeing that I had a heavy backpack and the terrain was quite difficult, I decided to take it slowly and do the hike in 2 days, planning to spend the night at a lake I noticed on the map. I didn't pass any cabins in a part of the area that wasn't that popular, so I knew I wouldn't meet a lot of people there. As I approached the lake where I was planning to spend the night, the weather suddenly turned. The rain only started during the night, but it became heavily clouded just after noon. Being surrounded by dark mountains without anyone nearby felt very eerie. The closest thing resembling human presence was a large silver balloon in some strange shape, floating around aimlessly. Not exactly comforting, on the contrary. It might not sound very creepy, but in that moment, I felt like I was in a place where I didn't belong, or even where humans in general didn't belong. It rained heavily all through the night, only stopping for 20 minutes in the morning, giving me time to pack again and leave that place. After an entire day walking through the rain, I was happier than ever to sit in front of a fireplace in a cabin, surrounded by people, and read a book. The new moon trip to a haunted waterfall at midnight. The waterfall was questionably renowned for being a place where lots of indigenous people were pushed to their deaths. There were also numerous suicides there. If you took the walking trail that wove down the side of the steep terrain, you'd reach the bottom of the waterfall, an eerie place where people claimed to see ominous orbs of light, mysterious circulating winds, and bizarre decorations of sticks, rocks, and animal bones. People claimed that there was a witch down below, or what remained of one, and that up above were the vengeful spirits of those murdered. Now it is quite common for people to feel the urge to jump, not out of sadness but just suddenly. I wonder what would happen. Some of the suicides were by people who had never had any signs of depression or anything of the sort, they just drove up to the waterfall and didn't return. My cousin and I decided to go looking for something to do. He was going backpacking overseas in a couple of days. He had shared with me his terrifying experience of going to an abandoned asylum in Tasmania with a group of his friends. I will share this story later. So we jumped in the car around midnight and headed to the dirt road that took us to the waterfall, which was half an hour away. It just happened to be a new moon, so there was very little natural light. My cousin was showing me his nice metal microtorch, which he had brought to take with him when he traveled. It was a sturdy little torch with a sandpaper-like grip, and it was surprisingly bright. I had my fully charged DSLR camera with me. We arrived at the parking area and decided to walk through the shallow, rocky river that leads down to the waterfall. I took a few pointless pictures as my flash lit up the forest. We listened for sounds. It was really quiet, there were a few watery gurgling sounds here and there. But there were no wildlife sounds at all. Which was surprising as during the day it was busy with birds, gannas, echidnas, and snakes. It's not like there weren't any nocturnal animals in the area, it was just weirdly tranquil. A little disheartened, we decided to head back to the car and walk the other path. It led to the lookout, protruding part way out, off to the side of the big waterfall. We could only see the waterfall by my cousin's torchlight and couldn't see much of anything else. I snapped a few worthless pictures. My cousin dropped his torch, and it landed just out in front of us, shining up at us. He lifted himself over the railing. I quickly grabbed him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I can just jump down and get it." I pulled him back over, telling him, "You can't jump down to get it, there's no ground there, it's a cliff." "Your torch is caught on a branch," he said, looking surprised. I don't think he realized the lookout actually protruded over the cliff. We looked back at his torch. "I can still reach it," he said, and it dropped from the precariously thin forked branch it was caught on, disappearing into the darkness. Now I take you back to when he dropped the torch. I was taking pictures on my camera, and just before it fell from his hands, my camera malfunctioned. It wouldn't take any photos. It was on, but I pressed down the button, and it froze up. It wouldn't respond to any commands. We felt very freaked out. At this point, an icy breeze blew up from the precipice. We turned and ran. When we were driving back, my cousin explained that the torch was bumped from his hands, and he thought I did it. He was actually annoyed with me. Then he told me that he didn't even think, as he was climbing over the railing, he was just acting. I told him then about people having the sudden urge to jump. This freaked him out even more. We thought back on the whole scenario recently, and it really spooks us, even now. This happened last year, maybe in October or November. I don't know anymore, it's actually really confusing, but I need some answers, and that's why I'm going to tell my story here. I, W14, was 13 last year around that time, and I've had a rough day, so I decided to go out for a little just to make up my mind and get a bit of fresh air, and it was around 5 p.m. It was already a bit dark outside, but I still went out. I was walking around the village where I live, and I had been walking for like an hour already. Now it was around 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. It was already dark at this point, but the lanterns were on, so I still had a bit of light. Well, there is this place where I and my friends spend hours just talking and sitting there in the summer, and it is already an hour. Now it was around 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. It was already dark at this point, but the lanterns were on, so I still had a bit of light. Well, there is this place where I and my friends spend hours just talking and sitting there in the summer, and it is one of my favorite places. Well, long story short, I was walking there, and it's like an abandoned place, but people still pass by it because beside that place there is a lake. So you need to imagine that before the building there is a gate that you can open on your own, and next to it there is a small path. So I was listening to some music and I was walking through that little path and I noticed a light behind me getting more and more bigger, so I turned around and there was just a car, which was normal because there were parking spaces, so I didn't think much of it, but I already had a bad feeling. As I started to walk again, I heard the car stop. If you have AirPods in for a longer time, you get used to the volume and you can hear the things around you a bit clearer. That's why I heard it. This bad feeling was getting really strong, so I turned around again, and a person got out of the car and started to walk my way. I got scared and started to walk again. A bit faster but not that much, so that person didn't notice, you know? Well, I turned around again, and that person was at the car again. I reminded myself of two people in the car, one driver and one passenger. The person who was the passenger was taking something out of the car, and the minute that person turned around, they started to run, so I freaked out and started running too. I was panicking and running, my head hurt and my throat felt dry. I was running all the way to the restaurant that was a couple meters in front of me. In that moment, I was really scared. I needed to take a turn there, and in that moment, as I was turning the corner, I felt someone reach out to me and try to grab me, but they didn't get me. Now here's where the part is where I need help, because when I was in front of the restaurant, I turned around and there was like a wall, but I just went up till the knees because there was the ending, and I turned around and there was this person, and besides that was a lantern, and that thing was black, like all black. I couldn't make out that it was because it wasn't a person. It had big white eyes, and it scared the shit out of me. It was going down like trying to hide behind that wall, but it was too big, but I managed to hide behind that wall, and I don't get how the duck it could make it because that person was really tall. I'm a tall girl, I'm like 5 feet 7 inches, and that thing was much bigger than me, and I still don't get how it could just disappear like that behind that wall. It just went down so smoothly, it seemed like it didn't have a problem, and with these eyes, I just can't forget about them. They seemed like they had no life in them, they were just white somehow, and it still scares me. I don't know. Maybe my head just made that up because I was pumped with adrenaline, or maybe I was just scared, but anyways, yeah, I just wanted to ask if that maybe happened to some of you too, or if you know what it could have been, because at first I looked like a person and then not anymore. If you listen to all that, then thanks. I know it's a lot, and I appreciate it. As I said, I just wanted to ask if maybe someone knew what it was. I was around the age of 11 when I went on a field trip with my 5th grade class to an abandoned old-timey school ground. We were mainly there so that the teachers could show how lucky we were to have the kind of schools we have now. The school was pretty broken down, with a few of the windows cracked and floorboards molded over. We weren't allowed to touch anything unless the teachers told us explicitly that we could for obvious safety reasons. Anyway, there was a pretty large yard surrounding the building's east side, with large, crooked trees thriving all over the area. About 3 hours into the event, we were given a 45-minute lunch break to eat in the yard. After eating, which only took about 10 minutes, me and my small group of friends decided to wander around the place, looking for anything that could amuse our naive minds. We walked for a while, climbing up trees and goofing around, until we came across an incredibly withered oak tree. The bark was a charcoal gray color, with flakes torn off in seemingly random areas around the trunk, exposing the wood and various species of insects writhing around. As we walked up there, we noticed a strange object near the tree's base. It wasn't long until we could make out the light orange fur, black skin, and blood of a severed arm. We all jumped back in unison at the sight before slowly creeping back toward the tree to examine it further. The arm was only the size of a shoe and definitely belonged to a mammal of some sort, having an opposable thumb, dark-skinned palm, and short hair around the entirety of the limb, which only consisted of the forearm and elbow joint, which was exposed. We stood there, staring at it for God knows how long, with horrified faces, until one of our teachers saw us and quickly ushered us away before looking back with a puzzled look on her face. When I asked her what it was, she dismissed it as belonging to a squirrel, but I know what I saw. Squirrels don't have opposable thumbs, and they sure as hell don't have foot-long forearms. That was something else entirely. I sat alone on the bus on the way back, piecing together the evidence of what happened to try to find some kind of answer as to what the animal was and how it lost its arm, but with no luck. I was a huge animal enthusiast back then, and I still couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. Nor can I as of today. This event occurred in Oklahoma, US, for those of you who may be curious. Now I'm not trying to say I found a new animal or anything of the sort, but I can say that I do not know of any animal alive today that could have logically been in the area we were. When I was in high school, my friends and I got really into exploring abandoned places. We used to research places along the East Coast and drive during the summertime to check them out and take cool pictures. This one time, a kid we knew in my buddy class told him about this abandoned mental asylum in Maryland that was really cool because, unlike most places, it was a 5-building complex with a large center building that was 3 stories tall. Naturally, this piqued our interest, so that weekend we told our parents we were going on a fishing trip to Maryland, and 6 of us road trip to go see this place. We started out by checking out the smaller building in the complex when we first got there, and slowly made our way around the area to look out for security. To give a sort of layout to the asylum, all of the buildings were connected to each other aside from the main building and the church that was behind it. So as we entered the first building, we decided to pull a Scooby-Doo and split up to cover more ground. I got paired with a kid in the group that didn't really want to be there to begin with, and we went down to the basement of the building. As we went down, I saw that there was a crude doorway near the staircase that was out of place from the other large hallways upstairs. I convinced the guy I was paired with to check it out on the condition that I go first. The layout of this room was kind of like a ramp, so if you kept walking back, it would get closer to the ceiling and a lot darker. We had one flashlight, which I gave to my friend, and I was using my phone flashlight. So as I walked in, I naturally got drawn to walk straight back while my buddy went to the left side instead. I remember saying to him as we were inside, "Damn, this place smells like shit," and when I turned around, the guy I'm with walked towards me and said that we needed to leave now. Thinking he was just scared, I didn't argue with him, and we left, and I didn't think much of it for the rest of our time there. Later that week, my friends and I are at a party, and we're telling people all about this asylum we just explored. I start telling people about the main building, and the guy I was paired up with comes by to hear what we're talking about. As I start talking about the basement and the room we were in, he pauses the story. He then tells me that the reason he made us leave so fast was because, as I was saying that the place smelled like shit, he saw that the left side of the room had furnaces and piles of old shoes and white medical patient clothes. We were in the morgue, and I had no idea. There is a nearby town where I live, about a 15-minute drive from here, that has a specific road that is supposedly haunted. It's an urban legend that I first heard in high school. Off of the main road, there is an old trail that leads to a burned down and dilapidated convent, a nunnery that's been in the town since the early 1900s. The official story is that the building burned down back then due to an accidental fire, but the urban legend states that the priest who led the convent was practicing some pagan religion, devil-worshipping stuff, under the sisters' eyes. One day, one of the sisters found him in the basement of the small church, sacrificing a small animal to whatever evil deity he believed in and apparently muttering an incantation in an unknown language. The nun screamed and proclaimed that she would tell the entire town about this, and that the priest was going straight to hell to burn. Maddened at the thought of what it would entail next, the priest killed the nun and locked her body in the basement. The next day, he invited all the sisters to a meeting in the evening, stating he had something to show them. When they arrived, he locked the doors and windows of the convent and proceeded on a murder spree, killing all the nuns who dared question his beliefs in his deity, some say using a knife, others his bare hands. Realizing what he'd just done and knowing he'd surely hang for this, he burned the convent down, but not before declaring his love to his deity and hanging himself in the rafters of the convent. Ever since then, they say that particular road has been haunted by the lost souls of the nuns, and that you can hear their wails and cries as they lament at their lives being cut in such a brutal and unjust way. If you go there at night during specific hours, the legend goes that the wraiths of the nuns follow you home unless you say some kind of prayer. A few friends and I visited the burnt-down building one night back in high school as a dare, and one of my friends started screaming at the top of his lungs, saying that he saw a shadowy, hanging figure in the rafters of what was left of the ceiling. We all started hightailing it out of there as quickly as we could, never looking back. There were so many variations of that urban legend, but that one in particular stuck fresh in my mind. You can believe in whatever you want to believe, but I'm certain the official story is much more mundane and believable. The place probably did indeed burn down due to an accidental fire, but nobody was hurt or killed, nor were there any practices of Satan-esque sacrifices or murders. But, of course, urban legends make the best stories. I would love to go back to that town and dig through their archives to see what actually happened and how this legend got started. That area is off limits, by the way, and police take notice of any trespassers on the trail or the building itself. That was years ago, so maybe the place has been demolished by now unless it was preserved by their town's historical society. A friend of mine's dad used to be a cop but is a probation officer now. I decided to go on a camping trip and wandered into a very suspicious problem. In Texas, there is an abandoned YMCA camp. No one knows why they left, but everything is still there. It seems like they just got up one day and left. No employees or campers have come out or said why. Well, he decided he, his son, and 2 other father officers would go on a camping trip there. They drive up to the city it's near and flash their badges, saying they need the code to get in. No one knows it or wants to give it to them. They finally get an 80-year-old bartender after a couple drinks. They enter, and it's exactly what they thought, abandoned with sailboats and tents still there. They hike for a while and find a place to camp right next to a hill. He says he saw what looked like a man crouching down and watching them on top of the hill. He and another dad go up there to check him out, but when they get close, he's not there anymore. But when they walk back down, he's there again. They just assume it's a heat illusion or something. They continue their day and then go to bed. In the middle of the night, he hears his buddy outside on the left side of his tent, telling him, "Hey, can you help me out here?" He starts to put on his shoes and hears to his right where his tent is, saying, "Don't get out, that wasn't me." He stayed in his tent and heard what sounded like the same people telling him 2 different things. He eventually falls asleep and wakes up to everyone packing in a rush. On the ground, written in black chalk or ash, it says, "Leave now or else." They immediately pack up and head back to their car, and now the car won't start. In such a rush, they hike out and back into town, go to the police station, and not a single officer accepts to go into the camp to investigate. After searching all day, they find a mechanic who has a tow truck, saying he would go in but for a hefty price. He tows the truck out, and once at his garage, it works fine. I didn't have to touch it. I couldn't understand why it didn't work before. This happened in June of 2022, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. My buddy lives in a rural Welsh village, one with a population of what I assume to be less than 100. Houses are fairly spread out, and it's around 3 to 4 miles away from the nearest town or other village. When I head up there to stay with him, we enjoy going on nighttime walks along the country lanes since it's really quiet and there are barely any cars out after 10 p.m., and this particular night was no different. I feel the need to include that his house is connected to an old chapel, and he's responsible for cleaning it, looking after it, etc. Beforehand, we had been ducking around in the chapel, throwing footballs around, and having a laugh. This is relevant to the story, I think, anyway. But we thought nothing of it. And less than half an hour later, we headed out to go on a walk. It was me, my buddy Lucas, and our other friend Reese. Now, Lucas knows these roads like the back of his hand. He's lived there practically his whole life and has walked this particular route that we headed along more times than he can count. We were walking and ended up just about a mile away from the nearest village, where an old, abandoned hotel used to be. The building's been knocked down by now, but there are fences blocking where it used to be. This didn't creep us out much, but what happened next did. Lucas pointed through a thick layer of trees at what seemed to be a house with no lights on at all, and despite walking this way many times before, he had never seen the house. He insisted that the architecture was a lot different from the houses we usually see around this area, sort of European, or Germanic, as he claimed, his family is German. He wanted to get a closer look, but the house was blocked off by a construction fence too, which we thought was really weird. I shone my phone light through the fence, and we got a quick glimpse of the actual building, but then came a weird feeling of dread, and we all got this feeling at the same time. It was eerily quiet, no wind, no bugs, no nothing. Now feeling incredibly uncomfortable, we continued along the trail, a little further away from the house. Nearby was a wall blocking off a field, and so we sat on the wall to kind of comprehend what had just happened. Across the field, about a mile off, maybe less, was the village's church. We had tried to laugh the situation off, covering our uncomfortable feelings with jokes, until a single church bell rang out from across the field. Just one. By this time, it must have been around 11:30 p.m., so it wouldn't have made sense for the church bell to be ringing. And even so, it only rang once, which wouldn't have made sense either. We all kind of looked at each other, and Reese insisted that she felt like we shouldn't have been there, speaking exactly what we were all thinking. Me and Lucas agreed, and we quickly continued onto the path and through a wooded area. The walk back to Lucas' place was long and grueling, and the feeling of dread didn't help at all. We didn't speak about the experience the whole way back until we felt safe enough to. Lucas was hung up on the fact that he had never seen that house before and had never felt that uncomfortable in this particular area before, despite doing this nighttime walk countless times. So, we searched around the area on a live satellite system and discovered that where the house should have been, there was nothing but a patch of dirt and some shrubbery. The whole situation seemed completely ducked to us. Everything just felt wrong, the house, the church bell, even the feeling we got while being in that area. the feeling of not being welcomed. Reese did a quick search online on ley lines to see if any of them crossed each other in the area. Ley lines are prehistoric lines that run across the UK, and some believe them to be hotspots of paranormal activity. And much to our horror, we discovered that exactly where we were sitting on that wall, 2 ley lines crossed each other. To us, that explained why we must have felt uncomfortable, like we weren't welcomed. We decided to go back the next day, and in the daylight, we discovered that the house was not there. The 3 of us were completely sure that we had seen a building, with Lucas going so far as to say that he could see the architectural structure of the house. Even in the comfort of the daylight, the area just felt wrong. It sounds insane, I know, but it's been itching my brain for the past few weeks, and I needed to tell someone about it because my family doesn't believe me and Lucas and Reese's families don't believe them. I'm hoping that by getting this story out there, someone might have an explanation as to why the house was there and then suddenly wasn't. An explanation as to why we felt so scared and dreaded what would happen if we stayed in that area. I can't help but think it had something to do with us ducking around in the chapel. Maybe I sound completely insane, but this whole situation doesn't sit right with me. We all felt the same thing, and we're certain that the house was there that night and then wasn't the next. We know what we saw and felt, but we have no explanation for it. Once, when my cousin and I were in our low teens, we would get bored and wander around our neighborhood looking for things to do. One night, we came across this house that was very poorly taken care of and seemed empty. Years before, the people that lived here were very active, growing gardens and raising animals. But for a while now, it looked abandoned, and there were never any cars around the property. So that night, we decided to go check it out. We started by jumping the fence and wandering the yard looking for any valuables because it almost looked like a junkyard to us. We wandered over to a camper and walked inside. We looked in cupboards, peeked through doors, and checked under cushions but found nothing. We suddenly heard a small thump behind a garbage can. We were shaking, and I didn't dare check what it was. And out of nowhere, a black cat jumped up and out of the camper, and we screamed like little girls. We decided to move on from the camper and go check out the house. It was abandoned on shore. We haven't seen anyone here in months, if not years. We tried for the front door, but it was locked, so we moved around to the side and tried the windows. They were locked. Next, we tried the back sliding door, and it opened. But only a few inches. Eerie was stuck on the other side, wedged between the wall and the door. We had to reach in to move it. My cousin was shaking and wanted to go home. But we got so far already, why not just have a peek? So I wedged my head and arms in and reached for the stick. I couldn't reach it. I pushed harder and further, trying to reach. Just then, I heard a loud, deathly scream, louder and more high-pitched than I'd ever heard. And I heard thumping down the stairs. It was an old lady, not walking, not running, but charging at me. She came out of nowhere and with no warning. I tried to pull out, but I was stuck. My cousin ran, he was scared enough already. I pulled with everything I had in me, scarring up my arm, knocking, and almost pulling off my ear, trying to get out. And just as I pulled myself out of the door, the screaming old lady slammed into the glass door, banging her hands and head at it, screaming and mumbling at me words I could not understand. I ran, half shaking, half numb. I've never felt so lightheaded and numb in my life. My cousin and I asked around the next day, and we found out from some old siblings of mine that there was a crazy old lady living there who thought the world was ending. And she found that she never went outside because she stocked food, and she never left the house in fear of other people. She had no vehicles, and she lived alone. We also learned she had some kind of mental problem. The very next day, I was walking the neighborhood, and I spotted a vehicle and a man in her yard. I stopped and watched as the man pulled out 2 bulldogs. I assumed she thought we were trying to rob her, and I felt awful about everything that went down. What I learned from this is that no matter how tempting or how intriguing something looks, if it's not yours, then keep away. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City, in northern Michigan, during the summers with my parents. Traverse City, TC, is a beautiful place, produces 75% of the world's cherries, and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1989. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historical significance, the buildings on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourism traps, cafes, etc., but many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system, which the hospital staff use to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. I am sure there were instances where the patients underwent cruel treatments or were subjected to the care of horrible doctors, but the TC Psych Hospital had a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unashamedly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, we would often break into abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for or trying to justify my criminal act of B&E, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightened youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty ironic considering we made up most of them. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something that terrified me to the point where I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m., the moonlight was dim, and most patrol guards left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used and followed our regular path to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the windows that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from our others, a new faint and unexplainable smoky odor, not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up to the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grip my wrist so hard that his nails left marks on my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with the sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead, bloodied bird, surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers, but I personally don't remember doing that. I wouldn't be too terribly surprised, though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way that guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed bloody murder, whipped around, and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men smiling at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be too crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I sprinted past the two, and I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running. We obviously didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. When we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather gotten caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot, whether the cause was fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of both. I'm not sure what would have happened if the occultists caught us, but I know for certain they weren't going to crack open a beer and sing Kumbaya by the candlelight. I'm not familiar with cultic practices or satanic rituals, so I'm not sure what the men were trying to do or if they were summoning something. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know that horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until we die. Me and my friends enjoy making mountain bike trails in the woods on a mountain near our houses. One day they couldn't go outside, so I brought my younger sister with me. I was also going to bring my little brother, who was going to be a little bit late since he was at a friend's house. This day was a little bit rainy and cold. Nobody would be hiking the trails this day. They had never seen what me and my friends had been working on for the past couple months, so that day was the day to show them. Basically, you walk straight a trail, and when it turns 90 degrees, you go to the right off the trail, then around a bend, and there is an overgrown abandoned forest road. At the end of this forest road, we had a small trail that led to the bottom of our MTB trail. Me and my sister waited for my little brother, but then my mom called me, telling me that my brother didn't know where to go, so I told my sister to go all the way back to wait for him outside the trail in the neighborhood. She never saw him since he decided he didn't know where to go, despite the clear instructions, since my mom then called me once more, telling me he was back at home. Then I called my sister to tell her to come back up the trail, telling her very clearly, make sure nobody is following you. This wasn't for our safety, but so nobody would discover these trails me and my friends were building. But this time it was different. As my sister was walking up the trail, I could look from the side all the way across the forest road, where she was on her way up. Then I thought to myself, was she wearing a white jacket before? Then I realized, as the figure got closer to the clearing, that this was not my little sister. This was a grown man. Nobody would ever find this trail, and if they did, they would have no reason to come up here. Plus, the rain over the past couple of days has made most of the trail muddy. Extremely muddy. I stared, running down the trail and then behind a tree, so I could call my sister to tell her not to go up the trail. Then I heard, "What are you doing?" It was my little sister. She had already made it all the way up and back to the trail. Then I knew what had happened. This man walked up the trail with my sister. I was terrified, and I could tell when my sister started to pick it up that I was serious. We waited around 10 minutes, but we couldn't see the person anymore. There was no way to go but up the trail towards us, unless this person hid in the trees off the forest road. As we made our way back quickly and quietly, I felt the sense that I was being watched. We made it to our bikes, which were, thankfully, still there. I told my sister to pick up her bike so we could walk through the rest of the trail without the noise of our hub clicking. This way, we could hear everything going on around us. Then, towards the entrance of the trail, where it is much easier to see footprints, there was one set of large boot prints on top of my sister's small footprints, meaning they were more recent. That confirmed I was 100% not going insane. We started riding bikes to the neighborhood, where I made sure we weren't being followed. Luckily, we made it back home. We told our parents, who were glad I was out there too. All I could think was, what if I wasn't there? What would have happened to my sister? So I recently got my first dog. She's an 8-month-old chocolate lab, and she's very well behaved and affectionate. I've been training her to go on walks around my neighborhood. The thing is, there's an Eerie abandoned house a couple blocks down from me. Historic, built in like 1890. And there's still a bunch of old furniture that you can see through the windows, but it's obvious that no one has lived there in at least 5 years, probably much longer. My dog never barks at people or growls, although she is very curious. But every time we walk past this house, her fur stands up, and she begins growling and barking while looking in the windows. We can walk past a person, and she'll just look at them and maybe sniff them a bit, but this house drives her bonkers. I know it's a cliché, but it really seems like she can see something through the windows that I can't and my wife can't. I can't stress how out of character this is for her. Has anyone else ever had an experience like this? I kind of want to investigate further, but it's pretty creepy. I want to preface this by saying I'm not particularly religious, nor do I necessarily believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something weird happened that night that I can't explain. This story is 100% true. So let's call it Wednesday. As I don't quite remember what day it was. Around 5 p.m. a friend tells me about an abandoned building her friend showed her the day before and asks if I want to check it out sometime. Of course I do, but, being the curious soul that I am, I wanted to go that night, whereas she could not. I ask a few other friends to make the journey with me, and all decline either because they aren't into the whole B&E/trespassing thing or because they're otherwise busy. I decide to go alone. This isn't something I usually do, as I have a few close friends who are just as experienced as I am in urbex, and the three of us are an excellent team when it comes to stuff like this. I've gone to places alone before, but never with this little research done on the area. I couldn't find anything on the internet about this place. I decided to say duck it and go, as I'm not one to back down from an opportunity like this. So I grab my bag, flashlight, and camera, and I'm on my way. I tell someone exactly where I'll be in case something happens and to call the police if I stop responding for a few hours. I arrive about a mile from the location and start my journey. Most of it is woods and creeks, but the last bit is a dilapidated parking lot. I get to the lot and see not one, but 2 buildings to explore. This is turning out better than expected. I choose to go into the building on the left, as it looks more easily accessible, and start looking for a way in. Around the back, I find some metal stairs that have been overgrown and look like they're close to collapsing. I decide to take my chances and slowly climb them, keeping my eyes on each step to make sure I'm not going to fall through anything. I climb the stairs just fine and get to the second floor. The door is closed, but it opens just fine, no lock or anything. I'm in. Looking around with my flashlight, I see that this place is in better shape than a lot of abandoned buildings around my location. Part of the roof has been caved in from a tree falling, but everything else looks pretty good. I walk around the entrance room a bit more, and I realize where I am. There are note cards all over the floor with basic information on people. First and last names, address, DOB, diagnosis code, and inpatient or outpatient with a check next to one. I'm in a psychiatrist's office. Nice. I love these kinds of places, and insane asylums are my favorites to explore. I take a seat and look through some of the patient cards. I look up diagnosis codes and try to get a profile of who the person is. No particular reason, just interesting stuff. After a bit of this, I stood up and continued my journey. Now, the way this building is set up is basically a giant letter I with the entrance stairs I used at the bottom and a boarded up main entrance in the center. The only set of stairs to the first floor are at the top of the I. I look around some of the second floor rooms and don't really see much. Mostly empty offices with a chair or a lamp in the room. I do, however, find a room that I assume was for children to play in while their parents were seeing a psychiatrist. It had a sandbox and some toys laying around, but I noticed someone took some of the sand and drew a pentagram on the floor with it. I chuckled. After seeing everything I needed to see on the second floor, I went down to the first floor. The stairs are steep and winding, but very sturdy. I check the door to make sure it won't lock behind me and make my way down. The first floor is basically just a long hallway with rooms along one side and a reception area on the other. I start checking out the rooms on the right side. After a few interesting rooms, break room, kitchen, storage closet with Christmas stuff inside, I come across this office with something interesting on the desk. The desk in this office is filled with messages. These notes contain messages that make me a little uneasy. They go like this. He is planning on letting the hostage out. 4:30. Do we have staff accountability yet? 4:35. Can Officer John escort Jane out of the room? 4:42. This is where things get weird. As soon as I take the picture on my phone, the entire building starts shaking violently. My first thought was earthquake. Now, I'm not speaking from experience, but I have to assume an old, dilapidated building isn't the type of place you want to be during an earthquake, so I start to make my way back out, only this time rather briskly. As I get upstairs, I notice the door I propped open to keep from locking me down is now only slightly ajar. The small piece of metal I propped it open with was nowhere to be seen, although I didn't look very hard. As I'm walking or jogging my way out of this gym building, I notice that every door I had opened upstairs is now closed tight. What the hell? Was someone messing with me? I didn't want to stick around and find out. As I was leaving the larger room I entered through, I noticed the door I came in was shut. I tried it, but nothing happened. The ducking thing wouldn't open. Now, I'm pretty calm under pressure, but this was beginning to be too much. I was starting to freak out a bit. I made the quick decision to force my way out. Typically, I hate doing any damage to a building I'm exploring and usually try to avoid it whenever possible, but this was a special case. I wanted the duck out of there. Kick the door down. I've done it before, but this door didn't seem like it was going anywhere. It opened the other way and was very sturdy. I guess I'm kicking out the pressboard covering the window next to it. Luckily, these windows were huge and low enough that I could get a foot on the wood. 2 kicks, and the wood gives out. The building is still shaking, so I made a hasty getaway down the stairs. Then comes the part that still frightens me. As soon as my feet hit the ground on the last step, the building stopped shaking. Completely. Everything around me was silent. I must have been going crazy. I know what I felt, and I know what I saw. I got out of there and didn't look back. A few weeks later, my crew freed up and wanted me to show them the place, even after I told them this story. Oddly enough, every other time I've been there, nothing out of the ordinary has happened. I'm not sure what happened or why, and I'm not one to believe it was a ghost or anything, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shame me up a bit. Was it just a well-timed earthquake? Possibly, but I heard nothing about it on the news the next day, and nobody else said they felt or heard anything. Any insight on this, whether it be spiritual, geological, or anything else, would be wonderful to have. Gettysburg National Battlefield is in Pennsylvania. During the Civil War battle on July 1 to 3, 1863, the Union and Confederate armies had a total of 51,000 casualties. 51,000 men were dead, wounded, captured, or missing in just 3 days. It's horrifying. Considering battlefield medicine back then meant no antibiotics, mostly no painkillers, and your surgeon was a guy with a hacksaw, your chance of surviving a serious wound was not good. Being captured meant being dumped in a prison where you starved to death, or at the very least, caught typhus, cholera, dysentery, pneumonia, or other life-threatening illness. I couldn't even imagine what those men went through. There's a monument everywhere. Markers on the fields will inform you that you are standing on the very spot where a certain soldier died. It's a beautiful landscape with a feeling of despair. My husband's third great-grandfather fought for the Army of Virginia during Pickett's charge. His family did not own slaves. Men from both sides were drafted. These men walked over a mile of open fields in search of about 7,500 entrenched troops and about 80 cannons. There was even hand-to-hand combat. The Union Army lost about 1,500 men here. The Confederacy had a 50% casualty rate, losing around 6,500 men. There are around 1,200 unmarked, unidentified Confederate graves scattered throughout the battlefield. 38,000 discarded rifles were collected from the battlefield. 24,000 were still loaded. It's the creepiest, saddest, lonely, and eerie place. The battlefield is considered one of the most haunted places in the USA. Take the historic battlefield tour. Then take one of the many ghost tours. It's a place where you feel a cold shiver up your spine while your hair stands on end. His third great-grandfather survived. His division managed to get to the wall, the Union soldiers were taking cover, and there was death and suffering on both sides. He was shot, captured, hospitalized for 8 months, and lost the use of his arm. I used to live on a small farm in the US when I was growing up. But as soon as I was 18, I moved out instantly, and I'll tell you why. When I was 12, me and my best friend Zach, who lived down the road, used to go into the woods to play. Since we lived in the country, there was almost nothing to do. We would always explore and pretend to be treasure hunters. I always used to take my dad's old cowboy hat, and Zach would take his small shovel every day. But if it was a bad day, we would just play some games on my Nintendo 64, this happened like 13 years ago, so it was the best you could get. We would always go a bit deeper into the forest every time we went in. We usually managed to find something interesting in the woods, like old coins, water bottles, some nice looking stones, and some other things. Yeah, I know, really lame stuff, but we were kids at the time, and we always thought of it as treasure. I had a small box under my bed to put the things I found in, and so did Zach. We had an awesome childhood, but some creepy stuff started happening over time. One day, while we were exploring the forest again, we came across a well. We got really excited, thinking we had actually found something good. We checked it out, but there was nothing special, and the well was dry. We pretty much got our hopes up for nothing. We headed back home, and another day was over. The next day was a Friday, and when we got back home from school, Zach went back to his house, and I went back to mine. Not long after having lunch, Zach was at the door. I grabbed my dad's hat and opened the door, and when I did, Zach was there with 2 other boys. They were much bigger than me and Zach. Zach introduced them as his cousins, explaining that they were staying with his mom and dad for the weekend. Their names were Danny and Simon. They were both 15.3 years older than me and Zach. They wanted to come with me and Zach into the woods. I agreed, so we went there. It was just a normal day for the most part, but Zach's cousins were total assholes, saying it sucked being in the woods and asking us how we never got bored out there. Later that night, around 11 at night, I got knocks at my bedroom window. It was Zach and his cousins. They told me to come down. I managed to get downstairs without awakening my parents. I opened the door, and the cousins asked me if I wanted to go to the woods. I had never been out there at night before, and to be honest, I didn't want to go, and I told them that. Then they said, "You're lost." They went off in the direction of the tree line. I changed my mind, grabbed my dad's hat, and ran after them. I caught up to them, and we started to walk deeper into the woods. I was scared shitless, and by the look on Zach's face, he was scared as well. The cousins stayed in front, shining their flashlights on the spooky trees. I noticed we were going in the direction of the well. I knew the place like the back of my hand, so I had a plan in case it hit the fan. We were coming up on the well, and suddenly the cousins stopped and turned off their flashlights. We asked them what was wrong, and they stood still like statues. Then we went around them, since we stayed behind them, and I froze as well. There was a person standing in front of the well. Not looking in our direction, thankfully, I stood there like a statue, not knowing what to do. Then one of the cousins, I think it was Simon, whispered, "Turn around slowly and walk away slowly, don't make any sudden moves." I complied, and we all turned around and started walking back slowly, so that figure wouldn't notice us. Then the terrible happened. I stood on a stick by accident and made it snap. It was loud, and we weren't far away enough from that figure, so we all stopped again. I looked back, and the figure was now looking at us. I almost fainted with fear. Then Danny screamed, "Ruin!" We all floored it. I dropped my hat while running back, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I had no idea if the figure was following us since all of our footsteps made it hard to make out, and I didn't look back either, so I didn't know. We all managed to make it back safely. I ran into my house and slammed the door shut. My parents were awake, and I got shouted at by my parents, and I was grounded for a week, but they also looked really relieved. My mom hugged me and said, "I'm so glad you're safe." I was confused and asked them what they were so worried about, and then they told me something that made me even more scared. They told me that recently, an escaped killer was on the loose, and he was last spotted in our area. When my dad saw that I wasn't in my room since he would usually check up on me and the front door wasn't shut, they thought I had been kidnapped, and they were about to call the police when I came through the door. After hearing that, I started crying. My parents asked me why, and I told them what had happened. Their faces were full of horror. After telling them that, they called the police immediately. Later on, they arrived. I explained everything to them, and they said they would look around the woods, so they did. Half an hour later, they came back with nothing, but they said that the next day they would bring more cops to search the area and warned me not to go into the woods again. I obliged. I could barely sleep that night because I was so afraid that the man would come for me. The next day, more cops came to our farm and started investigating the woods. They also went to Zach's house. My mom came in and said she found my dad's hat on the doorstep. I remembered that last night I had dropped it. How did it get there? I thought about some more, and when the man in the woods came to mind, I started panicking again. My parents calmed me down and asked me what was wrong. I told them about the hat, and they had nervous looks on their faces. My dad took the hat to a cop outside. I managed to calm down again, and for the rest of the day, I just played video games since my parents grounded me. Around lunchtime, we got a knock at the door. I answered that it was Zach and his mom. Zach's mom asked me if she could talk to my parents. I told my parents they were at the door, and then they told us to go in my room and play something. I put my ear against the door and listened. Zach's mom told my parents that Danny wasn't in the house in the morning, and after hearing the news about that creep in the woods, she began to worry. One thing didn't make sense, though. All four of us made it out safely. I was confused. Then Zach told me something that scared the living shit out of me. He said Danny had left the house when they got back. He left while Simon and Zach were sleeping, although Zach wasn't sleeping. Zach stated that he looked out the window and saw him walk into the woods. He wanted to stop him, but he said he was too scared to go out there again. He never came back. I asked him why he left. Zach didn't know. Then Simon came over to hang out later on. I asked him if he knew why Danny left the house, and he said he had an idea. Danny always used to carry around his dead mother's ring with him, since his mom had died a year prior to the events of the story. He always used to keep it in a box, and he would take it wherever he would go. Simon checked the box in the morning, and it was empty. He must have dropped it while we were running from that guy last night, he said. After that day, as weeks went by, the guy in the woods was never caught. The cops started an investigation into Danny's disappearance, and he was also never found. And me and Zach never went back into the woods again. Once we reached 18, we bought a house between each other and became roommates. Nothing's better than having a roommate as your best friend. I'm 25 now, I live with my girlfriend, and I still hang out with Zach, but even after all that time, I still think about that night every day, and I probably will for the rest of my life. This happened just a few days ago, and it terrifies me so much that I still look over my shoulder when I'm in a room by myself. So I work with construction in the office part of it. I have a team of guys and a girl who happens to be a really good friend of mine. We are all pretty young, early to late 20s, and had the opportunity to check out a building before demolition. Unfortunately, we weren't allowed to have cell phones or take pictures of anything because of safety. We couldn't be looking down on our phones the whole time, and our only communication was with walkie-talkies to a team outside. We were decked out in our field gear, steel-toe boots, jeans, safety vests, gloves, safety glasses, and hard hats, to be exact. Anyway, we went up to the top floor to check out the building while our boss did some technical work with a safety manager. As they were working, we were given the okay to explore a little. My friend and I went down a floor with the group to be away from the bosses and began messing around. The building was huge and still had some things inside of it, like tubes, pipes, old chairs, etc. You can imagine the jousting that took place. Long story short, a coworker got a bloody nose. Brian, and my friend, Jane, and I, being the only girls, took him into the bathroom to clean it up before having to report blood to the boss man, literally upstairs. So in the bathroom, we shoved his nose full of extra paper and washed it down because the water hadn't been shut off yet. As we were cleaning him up, a knock came to the door and "This isn't funny" type line. I went to the door and began to open it when I noticed it was jammed. Then I said that this isn't funny line. After a few tugs, I heard the panic in my coworkers' voices on the other side of the door and started pounding. We were all yelling something as blood started seeping through Brian's papers. Jane went to grab more when suddenly the bathroom stall doors all shut at the same time, bouncing off of the door stops, and the freaking lights went out. Someone screamed, it may have been me, and I started clawing at the door, yelling to let us out. This bathroom had 0 windows in it, and I can't even tell you how ducking dark it was inside. We were so scared, and Brian was cursing profusely. I heard a sudden rush of air, like in scary movies when the ghost is breathing, if you can imagine. It was like a freezing cold person was trying to exhale, I guess to put it into words, and I felt a horrible sticky hand crawl up the back of my hard hat. I ripped it off, and Jane screamed at the sound of it hitting the floor at her feet. Finally, a loud bang ripped the door open, and the others came rushing in, pale-faced. We were all yelling and screaming at each other. We all made it out safe, and I got my hard hat back from my boss checking out the bathroom. All he found was blood on the sink. I can still feel that hand on the back of my head if I sit here for a while, and I'm constantly wiping away at the air. I'm terrified of going to the bathroom by myself. Even at home, I have the dogs come in with me. I am a member of the United States Coast Guard. One night I was on duty, which pretty much means I have to stay on the ship I'm assigned to for 24 hours to respond to emergencies and stand POW watch. POW watch isn't hard, just 2 4-hour shifts of sitting in a shack outside the ship on the pier. Mainly, I'm just checking people on and off board and making announcements. I was working the 4 to 8 shift, so there was obviously not much going on at all. At 4 a.m. I did have a break-in with another member who wasn't qualified yet for POW and who acts as an assistant until they are. Let's call her Jill. Again, it was quiet and dark out with not much going on, so we talked about random things. We got on the topic of thrill-seeking, and she expressed how she went skydiving once and thought something was wrong with her because she somehow didn't get as scared or anxious as she thought she would. Admittedly, I thought she was showing off and asked if there was ever a time when she was genuinely terrified. At this, she visibly tensed up. She passed it off with an uneasy laugh, saying, yeah, there was. I never told this story to anyone, but it still creeps me out to this day. She took a deep breath. Have you ever heard of Kings Park Psychiatric Center? It's an old, abandoned asylum that was built on Long Island, New York. Like many abandoned asylums, it was very overpopulated and old, about 110 years old. After medication started taking precedent over lobotomy and electroshock therapy, the asylum eventually shut down. Cops would always hang around there because so many kids and teens would try to break in and explore. The campus is massive, though, with over 100 separate buildings, so they couldn't catch us all. One day, when I was a teenager, a friend of mine, we'll call her Sam, wanted to look around the asylum. I agreed to take her because I've been there a few times before. This time, however, I wanted to try and find the morgue building. Great idea, I know. I brought a police-type flashlight, one of the ones that is so bright that it's difficult to see the person holding it. I also brought a small pocket knife and a face mask to try and keep myself from breathing in too much asbestos. It was just getting dark out by the time we found the morgue building. Part of the first floor stretched out further than the second floor, and that seemed to be the only way in. So we climbed up the roof on the first floor and found a window we could crawl through on the second floor. I placed a thick towel I got from my backpack over the windowsill so we wouldn't get cut by any broken glass. The atmosphere inside was depressing, but beautiful in a way. Every surface was riddled with graffiti and vague messages from some kid, probably just trying to scare people. There was debris, trash, and broken floorboards everywhere, too. Still, we had a fun time being creeped out. We even found the morgue, and I even climbed inside one of the cold lockers, just to say I did. Once we got up to the roof of the building, we heard a commotion coming from ground level. Yelling and bouncing flashlights could be seen from where we stood on the roof. It looked like some kid was being chased down there by a cop. We watched and laughed for a bit, but knew if there was a cop around, we should probably get going before we were caught too. We headed down the flight of stairs back to the second floor. Sam was still walking down the stairs as I reached for the door leading back to the hallway, where our entry window was. As I grabbed the doorknob, I heard shuffling on the other side of the door. I couldn't help but gasp and freeze in place, and then the shuffling abruptly stopped. Many tense seconds passed before I heard a gritty male voice mutter, "Who's there?" "Crap, it's a cop," was the first thought to cross my mind. But then I noticed something else. There was another voice. There were 2 people on the other side of this door, whispering to each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying. I looked over to Sam, who was still halfway down the stairs, looking at me with a worrying gaze. I brought her here. It was my responsibility to be Mama Bear and get her out. As far as we knew, the only way in or out was through that window, and to get there, we had to go through this door. I motioned for her to stay put. The voices stopped whispering back and forth. I was pretty sure at this point that they weren't cops on the other side. But at this point, they didn't know I wasn't. "I need you to back away from the door now and show me your hands," I yelled as authoritatively as possible. Another long pause, but soon I heard shuffling noises backing away from the door. I took this chance and called Sam. "Stay behind me," I said while grabbing her hand. Once it seemed the shuffling had backed away enough, I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. I kept my flashlight high and kept my knife hidden in the sleeve of my free hand. Even still, nothing could prepare me for what I saw on the other side of that door. The first one I saw was a man. He looked about 40 to 50 years old and was at least 6 feet tall, way taller than either Sam or myself. He had on a white shirt, blue jeans, and work boots. It was a fairly open area, and he stood about 20 feet away from us. The hall we needed to get to was to our left and his right. I slowly walked forward, keeping the light on him the entire time and maintaining as much distance as I could. As we got closer, I got my first favorable look at the woman beside him and stopped in my tracks. She was wearing a yellow and black floral dress. Her arms hung limply at her sides. And her eyes were rolled back in her head. Her entire demeanor seemed non-existent. The oddest thing about the pair? They didn't look like squatters. The man was clean-shaven. Both of their clothes were pristine. They looked like a couple straight from a 1990s sitcom, as if a husband had just returned home from a construction job while his wife, in her floral dress, was baking a cake in the oven. And then, suddenly, they were teleported deep into the middle of an abandoned mental asylum. They just didn't match their surroundings at all. The man's gaze followed me while he remained perfectly still, while the woman seemed oblivious to what was going on, her eyes still rolled back, facing aimlessly towards nothing in particular. They never said a word. "Run," I told Sam, letting go of her hand as she took off down the hall to the left. I stood my ground with my light on the pair. I saw the man take a step back and noticed that the blade of my knife was showing slightly out of my sleeve. After I couldn't take it anymore, I turned and ran down the hall myself. It wasn't long before I saw the window, which still had the towel placed over the sill. Despite my heavy breathing and loud footsteps, I heard even louder footsteps coming from behind me, getting closer. I threw my backpack through the window and hopped through after it. Sam was already down below, screaming for me to hurry. I grabbed my backpack, hopped off the roof, and we ran like the wind through the campus and into the surrounding trees. My ankles stung from the fall, but I didn't care. I don't know what those two were doing there. They could have been on drugs, which would explain why the woman seemed so out of it. But why would they be so deep into this abandoned asylum just to get high? If they were squatting there, why did their hair and clothes look so clean? How did they even get in? And why was I chased? What would they have done if they had caught me? I never went back to explore Kings Park Psychiatric Center to find out. It was 2018, and my best friend and I were getting more adventurous as our senior year continued. We would stay out late, smoking weed, walking around various neighborhoods, or high-riding. Two young, 18-year-old girls. My best friend Julia is about 5 feet 5, has brown hair, and blue eyes. Then I was 5 feet 9, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Most would think we were absolutely stupid for doing some of the reckless things we did. Yet we did not care, we craved the adrenaline, and we were both a bit disturbed due to some trauma we experienced as individuals. Fear did not exist at the time, as we had been through enough scary situations to be numb to the idea of fear. At the time, it was close to the end of the school year, and honestly, our parents stopped paying attention to us most nights. I was home alone, and my best friend and I were left to do whatever we wanted most days and nights. That is when the idea of urban exploration became our new favorite thing to do. We explored all over our town in New Jersey and surrounding towns. Although we could not find a building that was daring enough for us thrill seekers, after searching YouTube for a couple days, that is when I found it, the holy grail of abandoned buildings near us. Only 30 minutes from us in Pennsylvania, there was an old, abandoned school that was home to delinquent children. After doing some personal research on the school, I came to find that the school was closed due to a fire that killed a student and teacher. Although after visiting the school a couple times, something told me several way more sinister things happened on the grounds of the school. There were about 25 buildings, so it took more than 6 searches to really get the absolute full experience this school had to offer. On campus, there was a security guard who drove around in a blacked-out Jeep. He never left his car. Only once did he catch us, although he just told us to leave. Again, never leaving his car. I still wonder if he had the same feeling about the place as we did and that he found sanctuary, never leaving his car. Since there were so many times we visited, I am only going to highlight the most terrifying moments we experienced, of course, from the least to the most blood-curdling. To give you the ambience of what we were facing, I will tell you this: to get onto the campus, you needed to cut through trees and bushes with thorns on them. Always wear pants when exploring. After you get through the brush, hopefully unscathed, you are greeted by several decaying buildings. The smell of mold and nature kind of all hit you at once. Absolutely everything there is overgrown and seriously falling apart. Graffiti is pretty much plastered everywhere. Besides the physical look and the gut-wrenching feeling you get when you walk foot on this property, that alone will make you want to turn back and never set foot there again. Something about this place is seriously wrong, and you feel as though you should not be there. Something I came to personally learn about this place is that every time you come back, things seem to get more and more out of place and otherworldly. Walking into these buildings, most windows are boarded up, so you can only see them using the small light on your phone. Other than that, it is pitch black. The first truly terrifying moment I had on this campus had to be finding the blood-chilling room, where it looked as though it was an old dentist office or something medical. I am not sure why it was there or what they really did there, but when I walked in, I got this strange feeling of death. Scattered in the pitch-black room, all I could see were open syringes covering the floor, a dentist chair that had dried red substance, resembling blood all over it, and everything else in the room untouched. As my best friend and I explored this small, dark room, we began to hear footsteps coming down the dark corridor. Trying to rationalize the noise, we automatically assumed it was the security guard and ran in the opposite direction, back out of the small window we came from in the other room. Upon reaching outside, we hid behind some coverage and waited quite a bit of time. We did not hear the noise again, nor did anyone come out. The next time we came, we decided to try and find the building that contained an old game room in it. Since we explored most of the buildings, we figured out which one it most likely was. After searching the perimeter for anything and checking the doors, we couldn't find a way in. Circling back, I found an old, dirty window that looked as if it opened to a dark, cement basement. Being the little badasses we were, I jumped through it almost immediately. The first thing we saw as we walked out of the closet window was a wide, open basement. With further analysis, we realized just how scary this basement was. The only thing down here, besides it being absolutely freezing in mid-May, was the old, worn fireplace. Written above the fireplace was something demonic, like demon worshippers had written it. Several pentagrams were graffitied. Looking towards the middle of the floor was the red paint of a pentagram, a very big smack dab in the middle of the floor. Candle wax was everywhere, and it was accompanied by a strange smell. With a sense of existential dread suffocating the room, we darted towards the steps at the back of the room. We did not step foot in that basement ever again. The second to last time visiting the campus, we decided to be even more ballsy and explore at night. It was roughly 12 at night, maybe slightly later, and again, it was simply just my best friend Julia and me. Besides it being dark approaching the school, my blood ran cold. Everything in my body was telling me to run the other way and not step foot back on this campus. Yet again, I ignored my gut instinct, and we began our journey through the woods to make it onto the campus. Tonight was different. I decided to actually document our journey as if we were on Ghost Hunter or some other paranormal show. The whole time I was recording, I would go back and forth from me to what I was seeing. As me and Julia began walking through the pitch black using only her phone, visibility was dim, we could see as much as 7 feet in front of us. The rest of this campus felt like it was not even there. Just utter blackness surrounded us. I was laughing and talking to my audience on my Instagram story, boasting about the trip as if it made me the coolest person ever to risk my life just to see some buildings filled with asbestos, mold, and possibly homeless people. Just as I turned the camera to face Julia and sort of interviewed her about her current experience, I saw what made my heart stop and my jaw drop. I froze in the position I was in, just holding the camera pointing in Julia's direction. As Julia looked past my camera, almost questioning why I got so quiet, she saw my face. The viewers at home could only see Julia's expression. It had said more to the people at home than either of us could explain. Seeing how absolutely horrified I was and how my face had turned the lightest shade it could, she let out a scream and grabbed my arm, pulling me in a different direction. I felt as if I was no longer present, and adrenaline had taken over my body. My legs were moving, yet it felt like I was not controlling them. We jumped and hid behind a tree as Julia pleaded with me to tell her what I had seen. For a couple minutes, I just sat there, trying to process what I had just seen. I did not want to believe that anything scary or paranormal could be real. It felt like a true scary movie came to life. When I regained my ability to talk again, I told her exactly what I saw. When I tell you, you most likely will not believe me, for it is so utterly insane that it's almost laughable. That image will never leave my memory, for it is burned in forever. Standing right behind Julia, just in the shot of my camera, was a large black figure. With a closer look, I remember not believing what I saw and becoming what felt like paralysis as I was stuck staring at this figure standing only 3 feet behind my best friend. A man on a large horse, from what I could make out, had no detail to him at all. He had literally been a shadow, just a blacked out figure. The worst part was that his large, broad body seemed as if it had no head. I know it sounds crazy, but trust me, it absolutely was. I had heard stories of the headless horseman as a kid, yet I never expected to see anything like that in my walking hours of the day. After telling my best friend what I had seen, we hightailed it back to Jersey and decided to do some more research to see if anyone had any similar experiences or the same ones. As we searched, I found countless stories that made my bones hurt about this place and what other urban explorers had lived there. One in particular made me literally almost faint. To be brief, this guy who had been really into exploring found this place years ago and decided, like us, he wanted to keep coming back and see everything the campus had to offer. He explained how every single time he came back, weirder and weirder things happened to him. To my knowledge, this was exactly how I felt. But what he said next made my soul sink to the floor. He explained that the last time he decided to go was at night. He explained how, in front of the red house, he had been chased out by a headless horseman. My stomach sank. I went right back to the live video I had taken and watched it again. The part in which Julia looks at my horrified face directly in the background shows the old, decaying red house half burned down. My jaw dropped. We did not visit this place for a couple of weeks. I would love to say I learned my lesson, and this is the end of the story. I would be lying. After a couple weeks had passed, our urge to visit the campus grew to an insane level. It was almost as if something was pulling us back, like we had strings attached to our bodies. Being the reckless kids we were, we decided 12 was not scary enough. Let's go at the devil's hour, 3 a.m. now. As we walk towards the woods, we need to cut through a thick fog that appears out of nowhere. If you think that was not enough to scare us away, you are right. I led the pack and proceeded towards a gap in the trees. As I am about 10 feet ahead of my 2 friends, I noticed some movement coming from the trees. We were not alone. Thinking who else may be out at 3 a.m., I started shifting backwards, alerting my friends as I slowly backpedaled. Just as my friends looked in my direction, a deer came running straight towards us. Right before it reached me, it stopped dead in its tracks, 2 feet away. This was like no deer I had ever seen. Again, I felt myself in short-term paralysis, as I felt like I was staring directly into the devil's eyes. The mist completely surrounds the deer, like an animal. To the point where I could not even see its feet. That's when I noticed its peculiar eyes glowing a weird yellow/red color. None of this seemed normal. That's when I noticed my friends booking it towards the street. Not wanting to be alone with this creature, I ran as fast as I could and eventually caught up with them. None of us wanted to admit how truly spooked we were, so we decided to try and find another entrance. Walking down the side road that followed next to the campus, we began to keep walking straight, occasionally looking for another opening. We then decided that at the end of the road, the campus had a church that sat on an open field. Thinking it was the safest way in, we kept walking down this road at 3:30 a.m. now, with absolutely no street lights. It felt like we had been walking forever, and small talk was at the minimum due to all of us low-key being scared shitless. That's when we heard it. We were almost to the church, it was about a quarter mile away from us. The sound of a chainsaw rang in all of our ears, sending chills down our spines. A chainsaw has a very distinct sound, yet in order to keep them faithful to the mission, I said, "Hey, maybe it's just a generator." Assuming they agreed with me, I proceeded to walk towards the strange noise. Suddenly, the sounds of speeding footsteps broke my concentration. Only they were headed away from me rather than towards me. This is when the fear really hit me. My friends were so far away from me that panic began to set in. I was only brave if I had my friends there to ease my anxiety. The second I noticed them running, my heart sank, and the chainsaw grew louder and more aggressive. I am downright sweating at this point. Finally, instinct kicks in, and I bolt towards my friends, somehow catching up with them immediately. We all decided to go home since it felt like the campus was doing everything in its power to keep us out. To this day, I'm not sure what was lurking past those trees, but I am not willing to ever go back to find out. Just remember, if you decide to go urban exploring, never go alone and always follow your gut. You never know what your animal instincts could be protecting you from.